Good morning, everybody. How are we doing? FFN land. What the hell is that? That was weird. Alright, we're hanging out with some Call of Duty. So Connor and Harris. We're looking at the objective elements, if any, of morality.
Great to be here. Great to finally meet you.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming.
Yeah.
Now, a few years ago, or a number of years ago now, on your now deleted Twitter account, you seemed to profess to be able to prove the existence of objective morality using a kitchen stove. Do you still think that's the case? Do you stand by this thread that now doesn't exist anymore? I have it written down here. I thought that maybe we could sort of go through it, because you've a couple of times now referred back to it and said, hey, I think this still holds up as a way to prove the existence of objective ethics. Yeah,
it's been years, or at least a year, since I saw that thread, so I'm not sure I can, perhaps I can improve on it now in conversation. But yeah, no, I think the argument for objective morality, we can talk about what objective means in that context, I think I'm confident in it. Yeah, I would love to hear your reasons why not.
Yeah, well, I found the thread. I had to sort of go into the depths of Reddit to find a copy somewhere that someone had saved. One of the things that I suppose admire about the moral landscape is that a great deal of the new atheist movement has been criticized. And people talk about new atheism in past tense these days. I don't know if you agree with that assessment, but one of the things it's criticized for is that it sort of knocks down this grand structure of religion and fails to erect anything in its place. But the moral landscape was at least an attempt to do that. So that's one thing that I like about it. I suppose, do you agree with that assessment of new atheism?
That it's passé, or that
it's something of a time gone by?
Well, I think it was, I mean, I never felt that it was more than it was, which was mostly just a publishing phenomenon.
What are we doing this
The four of us had published books in quick succession, and that is me and Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett and Christopher Hitchens. And
where are you coming in?
Then people began to treat us like a four-headed atheist, as though we agreed about everything, which of course we don't. But we agreed about most things relevant to the debate around reason and faith and science and religion. Modulo a few things, a few positive things I would want to put in place of the sort that you just referenced. I mean, an objective construal of morality and value, right and wrong and good and evil, and also a contemplative life. I mean, I used spirituality in scare quotes in my book, Waking Up, trying to revive that term. I think that was pretty quixotic. I don't tend to use the term spirituality myself anymore, but what I meant to say is that there's clearly an understanding of the furthest reaches of human well-being that we can arrive at ultimately, whether we have it in hand now, that is deeper than culture, that's not parochial, it's not merely a matter of anyone's invention, but it actually speaks to some universal truths about the possibilities of human consciousness, and even beyond, conscious machines, if we ever build them, etc. So all of that relates, I think we're going to talk about the moral landscape, all of that relates to questions of value as I construe them, and how a completed science of the mind could ultimately understand them.
And the moral landscape is something of an attack on relativism. This idea that seems quite popular among secular ethicists, that there's no way to, I suppose, objectively measure different value judgments against each other. I think it's clear that everybody values something. even if just subjectively. You need to have some kind of motivation to do essentially anything in the world.
What is my
The interesting
favorite
question
gun?
is
I don't think
how
I've
we can
unlocked it
measure
yet.
these against each other and determine which one is actually true. And the big selling point of the moral landscape is
I
that
like the
this is something
Tom
we can do with
the one that I got
science.
loaded up right now.
So I figured the thread
So
would be a
it's
good
fun to
place to
play with
start
so far.
because it's something of a summary.
Sure.
But I suppose we can go through and
What's your favorite gun on this
yeah,
game?
see who caves in.
Yeah.
So you begin by saying, let's assume that there are no oughts or shoulds in this universe. There is only what is, the totality of actual and possible facts. Second, among the myriad things that exist are conscious minds, susceptible to a vast range of actual and possible experiences. So far, so good, right? We've got a world of stuff. In that world are conscious minds that can experience things. Number 3 is where it starts to get, I think, controversial. You say, unfortunately, many experiences suck. And they don't just suck as a matter of cultural convention or personal bias, they really and truly suck. If you doubt this, place your hand on a hot stove and report back. What do you mean by suck?
Right. Well, so this is a kind of a funny way of hand waving toward my argument that I refer to in the book and elsewhere as the worst possible misery for everyone. Right. I think you have to grant the only thing you have to grant really from my argument for objective moral truths to get off the ground is that a universe in which every conscious being suffered as much as it possibly could for as long as it could, that universe would be bad. That would be worse than other states of possible universe. Worse by any measure of worse that makes sense. And the moment you move away from the worst possible misery for everyone, things get better, however incrementally, and better by any construal of that word that makes sense. And if you're not going to grant that the worst possible misery for everyone, I mean, it's worth lingering on what those words mean. I mean, it's the worst. It's not. It's absolute. There's nothing possible that's worse than this, as far as the character of conscious experience. And it's for everyone, right? So there's no story you can tell yourself about how we all get redeemed after this, or we learn a lot of good things that we can only learn this way. There's no silver lining. So this is a perfect hell, insofar as that's possible. If you're not going to grant that that's bad, then I don't know what you could conceivably mean by the word bad. I mean, there's no application of that term that makes any sense to me.
That's what this channel's about.
So if we're going
video games,
and whether or not you want to judge it as good or bad, whether you want to, you can entertain those thoughts. If you found yourself in that state, given what it is to have a mind, and given what it is to have a conscious experience of anything, you will be disposed to move away from the truly intolerable and pointless misery that you've been granted towards anything else that's better, and everything else will be better, right? So it'll be the analogous to taking your hand off a hot stove. So the simplest way for a human being in their kitchen to immediately get to the extremity of this is just, put your hand on a hot stove, or just imagine doing so, and realize how untenable all of your hair splitting will seem. There's no place to stand with your hand on a hot stove as a human being and say, well, maybe this isn't bad, or maybe I have a preference for this, or maybe this is this is just subjective. Maybe this is just my own personal bias, which suggests that this is bad, right?
I liked the way you used the phrase personal bias in the tweet. You said this isn't just a matter of cultural convention, sure, or personal bias.
Between education and
I suppose I would agree that it's not to do with bias, but when you talk about an experience sucking, or an experience being the worst kind of suffering imaginable, I suppose what I want to pick up on there is the word worst. When you say imagine the worst possible misery for everyone, presumably when you say worst there, you don't mean something like morally worst, because that would just be to beg the question, right? When you say worst possible misery, you mean something like the most intense amount of suffering, or something like that?
Well, it's bad in any way that things could be bad. So yes, I mean, there's the hot stove is one version of that. I mean, that is for creatures such as ourselves, that is a physical torture, right? And if, I would imagine that even if you had a masochist of some sort, if you just made it hot enough, it would cross into a threshold where, that would be nobody's preference. But there are other things that cause minds like our own to suffer, and so they could be ideas. It could be the knowledge that your kids are, being tortured in the same way in the next room, right? And that, so there's more to suffering than just extreme sensation. I mean, one thing I should add, I think you're probably headed here anyway, is that there are two senses of the dichotomy, subjective and objective, that we should tease apart, right? There's the ontological one and the epistemological one. And I guess I'll start with the epistemological. The epistemological one is the one that does differentiate between science and non-science, right? So if you're going to be epistemologically objective, that is to say, your epistemology relates to how we know things or think we know things. To be objective in that space is to be dispassionate, not ruled by bias and confirmation bias or otherwise. To be to use all of the techniques that we learn in science and reasoning generally, to not fool yourself, or not be fooled by others, right? So that your beliefs can more reliably track truth. So without personal bias, or from my saying that this claim is not merely a matter of personal bias, is to say that it's not epistemologically merely subjective, right? And yet the ontological split between subjective and objective is not doesn't cut across the science non-science divide. My argument is that we can be scientific, rigorous, honest, that is epistemologically objective, with respect to subjective facts. Some facts are subjective and some are objective, right? So it's an objective truth about me that my neurotransmitters are in whatever state. It's a subjective truth about me that my experience has a certain qualitative character. Mm-hmm. And I think many people imagine, and even many scientists imagine, that we can't, it's very difficult to make objective claims about subjective experience. But that's just clearly not true. I mean, we can make an endless number of clearly objective claims about subjective experience, even the subjective experience that we really can't know directly. I mean, the example, I give endless examples here, but we can objectively say that, in his last hour of life, Winston Churchill was not thinking consciously about how much he wishes he could get, Taylor Swift tickets, right? Or he wasn't thinking about string theory, or there's there's an infinite number of things we know he was not thinking. Yeah. And so those are objective claims about his subjectivity. So that's just
yes, and useful. I completely agree, and I think that's actually a really useful jumping off point here for talking about the worst possible misery being bad.
Okay.
Because I completely agree that there are objective truths about subjective states. So it can be objectively true that you are subjectively experiencing suffering, let's say. Yeah. And if we think about touching the hot stove, when you say that this experience truly sucks, the way that I would interpret a situation like that is that it is objectively true that anybody who puts their hand on a stove will experience an immediate subjective repulsion to that experience. Now, yes, if that's what's going on, it seems to me that the experience itself, let's say the badness of the experience, the part of the experience where I go, I don't like this, this isn't good, I don't want this for me, that's in the subjective side of the brain. The objective
ontologically,
thing,
yeah.
Yes, the objective thing is that subjective experience is being had. And so when we're talking about science determining value, I understand that once you grant that everybody agrees that putting your hand on the stove is bad, everybody agrees that putting the hand on the stove is bad for them at least. Well, once we sort of agree that that's the case, subjectively, that everyone agrees that, there are myriad objective claims that we can make about how to best avoid that kind of situation. That's fine. But I'm imagining a world in which everybody subjectively agrees that the color blue is the best color. I don't know what happens to our brain, some kind of pill that everyone's forced to eat, where if we look at any other color, we're just a bit sort of repulsed by it. We think it's disgusting. Maybe it makes us feel a bit queasy, right? And so everybody just agrees that blue is the best color. In the same way that if two roommates are trying to decide what color to paint a room, and they both just happen to subjectively value blue, you can treat it as if it were the case that blue is objectively the best color. Mm-hmm. You can know objective facts about what to buy and what not to buy when you go to the paint store, right? That's all fine.
So the curious thing, though, is that, so the argument he's saying is if there is enough subjective agreement to a certain experience or a certain claim, that it may be fair to call that objective because it is now shared by everyone. So that's kind of like the litmus test of what we determine as being objectively true. What? I thought I had a bunch of these. That's stupid.
Fine. But if I were to claim that because we both just instinctively prefer the color blue, and because we can know scientifically on the basis of that what color paint to go and buy at the shop, if I were to then say that I can scientifically establish that blue is the best color, that blue is what we should be going for, I think I'd be making a mistake.
Well, so I think if you push the analogy further, I probably don't have a problem with it. So I would acknowledge that there's a boundary, that the boundary between what we might call aesthetic.
I would say culturally objective, sure. Culturally objective. So it's only an objective truth on the level of culture. And then either disappears the higher the magnification or remains subjective at the low end of individual. So is subjectivity and objectivity existing on a spectrum? That a certain amount of subjectivity needs to be there for something to be objectively real? Why don't you think on that while I have a quick smoke? The TV just turned on. That was weird.
And what we're always tempted to call morality or ethics when things become more important. I think that's fuzzy, and if aesthetic differences were if you just turned up the dial of their importance, right? So if the difference between, and we can stick with color, I think it's less visceral for people than taste, but yes, I mean, let's just say that there was a certain color you could see that the pleasure of seeing it was so extraordinary that it just became one of the most important parts of any person's life to just get more of that color, around them, right? And let's say the color was, somehow resource constrained, right? So that, only rich people could get access to it, say. And let's say certain kids were born with a neurological deficit that didn't allow them to appreciate this color, but there was a surgery for that or drugs they could take for that. Mm-hmm. The moment you dial up the happiness factor with respect to seeing this color, the more it edges into moral and ethical terrain. Whereas, if you deprive someone of this color, well, then you really this is a kind of crime against them, right? And we'd want to send you to prison, right? So, I mean, it sounds very far-fetched, but this is analogous to, you can imagine a color so rewarding that it would be the obverse of essentially putting your hand on a hot stove.
Suffering, it would just become pleasure. In that case, I think that we stop talking in analogy, and we're no longer talking about color as an analogy for pleasure. We're just talking about color as balanced on top of pleasure. We sort of just push the analogy until we're just talking about pleasure again. Mm-hmm. We'll get back to Sam Harris in just a moment, but first, thinking about the big questions in life can take a heavy toll on our belt. So ban your right off your phrase. Suppose one way of getting at this is the way that you seem to always phrase this. You did in the tweet later on. You say, if we should do anything in this life, we should avoid what really and truly sucks. Elsewhere, you say, look, if bad means anything, it must mean the worst possible misery for everyone. I think a moment ago you said something to that effect.
Yeah.
To William Lane Craig, you put it this way: the minimum standard of moral goodness is to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone. If we should do anything in this universe, if we ought to do anything, if we have a moral duty to do anything, it's to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone. And of course, this seems intuitively true. The problem I have with this is what I would see as a charge of circularity, because it seems to me that the interesting claim that you're making in the moral landscape is that in a world where people think atheists cannot say that certain things are good and bad, if you're an atheist, there is no thing that is good, there is no thing that is bad, there's just stuff. Right. You're saying, no, we actually can say that certain things are bad. We can do that. And someone says, okay, show me how. And you say something like, well, look, if anything is bad, surely the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. But that first bit, that if anything is bad, seems to me the very thing that you're trying to establish. That's the interesting part. So when you say, if we have any duty in this world, it must be to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone. I could say, but the thing we're trying to establish is if there is any such thing that is dutiful, if there is any such thing as good and bad.
Right.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So let's go over this ground again and just notice a few more landmarks. So first, one of the things I do in the moral landscape is point out that there's a double standard with respect to how we treat ethics and morality and the possibility of moral truth, and the way we treat every other branch of science or philosophy or reasoning, where, and there's a few ways to see this. I mean, in one case, first of all, there's no branch of science or really any intellectual endeavor where you don't have to rely on something that is essentially a brute fact or something that's axiomatic. I mean, we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps everywhere. There's no foundation for physics or foundation for arithmetic even that is perfectly self-justifying, so that no one can stand anywhere else and say, well, why did you make that definitional choice, or why, that's not how I choose to think about it, right? It's just that in physics or math, when someone does that, when they have a massively seditious program, right? When someone says, like when we at the physics conference say, physics for us is our understanding how matter and energy behave in this universe. If a biblical creationist or some other person unqualified for the job comes in and says, well, no, I want to talk about physics, but I have a different definition. And I would ask you to justify your definition. I mean, how did you come to be so interested in matter and energy? Because for physics, for me, it's just whatever conforms to the book of Genesis, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in science, and really everywhere, but on questions of ethics or value, when we meet such opposition, we don't draw any conclusions from it. I mean, we just say, you can do whatever you want, but you're not part of our language game. We're not going to take you seriously. There's no temptation to take you seriously. There's nothing about diversity of opinion, even foundational diversity of opinion in those areas, which suggests to us that there might not be any real ground truth to the whole endeavor, right? There's no physicist who's losing sleep saying, Jesus, I thought, physics was on sound footing, and I thought, my investigation of string theory was, headed somewhere, but this creationist showed up and said he didn't even agree with our construal of physics. So that must mean that there is no such thing as physics, or it's just a cultural convention. We just made it up, So there's a double standard. With moral truth and ethical truth and value-laden truth, we say, oh, you're telling me the Taliban don't think it's wrong to force girls to live in bags, and they don't want them to read, and they'll throw battery acid in their face if they decide to learn to read. And they seem to have this alternate morality. So who are we to say that our colonialist, imperialist, post-Enlightenment morality is better or more true, right? We happen to like it more. We don't want to behave this way, but we're not. There's no footing there. So that move for me is specious. The other move, which is I think we have to some degree courtesy of Hume, is this idea that there's this radical disjunction between facts and values, that we can't. There's no way to describe how the universe is that can tell you how it ought to be, and so there's no even the totality of facts couldn't tell you what you should do next unless you add one of your merely human passions to the mix, right? Now, I'm happy to bite the bullet. There's two ways I've addressed that. And it's important to recognize that Hume did not spend a lot of time on that thought. I mean, it's practically marginalia in his work. I mean, it's like about a paragraph and a half or so, if memory serves. So he did not flesh this out, and yet many people take it as a total defeater against the whole project of uniting facts and values. One thing I would point out, there's two ways I've dealt with this. One is, there are any discussion of facts presupposes a whole host of values that we don't get for free, but we act like we get them for free. So value in logical consistency, value in evidence, value in elegance if you're in a mathematical field, right? Something like Occam's razor is a value, right? And so you presuppose our conversation about what's rational presupposes all sorts of values. And we don't tend to acknowledge it, but if I said to you, listen, I have an amazing theory of, the physical world, it just so happens, it really is amazing. It's better than anything you're going to get from Ed Witten or anyone else, but it's a little self-contradictory. I mean, so it's like you're going to catch me saying some things that contradict the thing I said just before, and it doesn't make any predictions. Right. Okay. So this is a joke. I'm talking nonsense. And yet that just shows you that I'm running roughshod over some values that are presupposing any conversation about what's true scientifically. The other move I'm happy to make, though I can talk really on both sides of this, is I'm happy, and this is what I was hand waving toward in that tweet thread, is I'm happy to dispense with this notion of ought and is and moral duty, right? People, one thing I didn't appreciate when I wrote The Moral Landscape is how much people are hung up on this idea that for moral truth to exist, it must contain the motivational component to follow this moral truth. And in addition to the motivation, it must contain an ability to persuade others that they should follow it. Right. So if I could tell you that something is really wrong, right? If it's some way you and I are living is really wrong, the mere understanding of its wrongness or its moral badness would get us to change our behavior by definition. Otherwise, how are we pretending to understand this? And I just think that's a false claim. But I'm happy. I mean, one analogy I would give is, just imagine Here's one case. I'm not actually making this case, but let's say this was true. Let's just say we agreed that vegetarianism is much more ethical than eating meat. And, if, I happen to eat meat, so I should be a vegetarian. I ought to be a vegetarian. I understand the argument. I see no flaw in it. So the fact that I'm not immediately pushed into vegetarianism proves somehow that this moral reasoning is kind of otiose, right? It's just not, I'm not tracking truth. If I were, the dominoes would just fall. But that's just an unrealistic picture of the human mind. That's not the way the human mind works. And by analogy, I would say, let's say I want to lose 10 pounds. I'm going to just keep this in the dietary space, right? So I want to lose 10 pounds. I'm absolutely sure I understand the physics of this and how I would do it. And it's in fact true of me that I want to lose 10 pounds, say, right? So without any caveat, I know I'll be happier if I lose 10 pounds. I know how to do it. I just need to eat less, and I just persist in eating less than I've been eating currently, and the pounds will disappear. That's just a fact-based description of my situation, but in and of itself is insufficient to get me to go on a diet, because as it happens, I want other things. I like to eat ice cream, preferably once a day, right? So that's not, I realize that's not in harmony with my wanting to lose 10 pounds, but there's more of me than the part of me that just wants to lose 10 pounds, right? So it's the persuasion, the motivation persuasion piece is another part of the conversation, but it doesn't actually dispute the fact that there can be such a thing as moral truth that we could come to understand.
Yeah, that's another thing that David Hume discusses, and it's a big debate within philosophy whether moral facts have to be intrinsically motivating.
Right.
Maybe we can circle around to that, because I want to begin with what you said about this idea of the double standard that exists. And you picture somebody walking into a physics conference and saying, I define physics in this way. And everybody at the physics conference turning around and going, I mean, sure, you can just do that if you want. You can define physics, mean whatever you want, but that's not really what we're talking about. That's not what people care about in this conference. So we're just not going to pay attention to you. Do you, when you publish The Moral Landscape, and there are a great many people in the academy who come out and say, this isn't allowed. Like you say, most people believe in this is-ought distinction. Most people think that good is something other than just well-being. Who's the one walking into the conference here? In other words, like, it seems to me that it might be more like you going into that conference and saying, I think that morality is about well-being, and everyone at the conference turning around and saying, you can do that if you want. I don't exactly have a reason why you can't just say that when I say good, I just mean the avoidance of the worst possible misery for everyone. Sure, but that's not really what we mean. And so do that if you want, but we're not going to sort of pay attention to that.
Yeah.
Do you see it that way around, or do you think it's the other way around, that you're the one with the sort of definitional consensus here, that people who are challenging you are coming in and you're the one who should be saying, well, we're not going to pay attention to you?
Well, to be clear, I'm not saying that truth is just a matter of consensus, right?
Sure.
So I'm saying that everyone could be wrong.
There we go. Truth is
one
not
person
a matter
could be
of
right.
Consensus.
But I'm saying that when you're at a conference wherein scientists and philosophers talk about morality, I view them as using various double standards and being lured into it, for understandable reasons. But it's like, I've been at a conference. I mean, this is actually one of the things that convinced me to write The Moral Landscape, as I did, is, I was at a conference where, there was kind of an eminent biologist and bioethicist who took me to task for my disparaging the ethics of the Taliban, right? And she said, that's just your opinion that forcing women and girls to live in cloth bags and beating them or killing them if they try to get out, that's not good for them, right? Like, who are you to say that, right? And my point is, who are we not to say that? If we know anything at all about human well-being, and we do, we know that this is not an optimal strategy for maximizing human well-being. And then you start meeting the people who say, well, who's to say that morality has anything to do with human well-being?
Yeah, see, that second step is the more interesting to me, because I agree that because we all agree that suffering is bad for us, right? And I want to talk in a moment about how we go from that. I mean, if I put my hand on a stove, I'm going to want to take it away. It doesn't follow for me that if somebody else puts their hand on a stove, that I'm going to have that same feeling that they should take it away. Well, we'll get to that in a minute, perhaps. But yeah, sure. If we know anything about well-being, we can it seems fatuous to say, well, that's just your opinion, man. Who are you to say anything? You might as well be saying the same thing about physics. Sure. But the problem is that physics is a purely descriptive enterprise, right? If you define things in particular ways, you can just sort of make sure everything's internally consistent, make sure that everyone knows how you're using your terms, and all is well. If you say that good just means something like well-being, if we just say that good is reducible to well-being, then I don't think you've so much sort of crossed the is-ought divide as just collapsed the ought into an is statement. You've sort of created this.
Sorry, I'm going to just read what you said there. That's why I didn't consider blue the objective best color in that convo, but culturally objective in that context. Right. So we can say that obviously he's moving towards saying, there is certain objectivities in the world, be them cultural or otherwise, that exist, and that we have the capacity to be aware of. They're intelligible. So where Sam Harris and I obviously diverge is in God. So my belief in an objective good arises out of the nature of what I believe created everything, where he says it's just a natural consequence of human evolution. God's got nothing to do with it. But I like Sam Harris, actually. I think he's a very smart guy, and he has a lot of really good points. Truth is not a matter of consensus. Like, it's perfect.
Semantic world in which you can say, whenever I say good, just imagine I'm saying something like avoiding suffering, something like that. I can translate any moral statement now into purely descriptive terms. I can say, it's not good for you to, or it's bad for you to not allow women to vote. And I can just translate that in your terminology as it causes more overall suffering when women can't vote. Now that can be true and false. Cool. Now we can do an investigation.
Well,
but it seems like we're not talking about ethics anymore. In other words.
Well, no. Again, that's why I think so much of our confusion here, and the reason why it's so well subscribed, is that we have this tradition of how we have carved up the pie of the topics intellectually, and the way we have taught ethics, and the way we've demarcated it from science and even from the rest of philosophy, and the way we've internally divided it into, consequentialism and deontology and virtue ethics, right? I think all of these boundaries tend to be misleading, right? And I think we can clean the slate, and we could in a purely descriptive way, which is to some degree where that tweet thread is pointing. You could say, let's just forget we even had this topic, ethics and morality and good and evil and value, and just forget about it. Let's just be truly naive as to what our circumstance is. We're clearly in a circumstance where there's a wide range of experience on offer, depending on what kind of mind you have. And a few things are true about this, which are clearly true, and I think clearly give us a realistic picture, a philosophically realistic picture of the space in which we are making various truth claims. One is there are horizons past which we can't see, right? That we've only had certain types of experiences, and our nervous systems only allow for certain types of experiences, and we don't know how we would be able to navigate in the space of all possible experience if we changed our nervous systems, or we changed our minds at the level of ideas, which is also a change to the nervous system, obviously. We don't know what experiences would be on offer if the intuitions we had, which give us this gut sense that certain things are good and bad and right and wrong, if we figured out how to change those and then felt differently about the same things, right? And then we could step back and ask the further question: what would be descriptively, what would be the consequences of that happening? And maybe it's in fact true that if we live in such a universe that if you kept your hand on a hot stove for 30 seconds, you would be ushered into the most sublime experience imaginable for the rest of your life, right? Your life would be a paradise thereafter, right? And yet none of us have discovered that because at 29 seconds we all tap out, right? Now that's just there's no reason to think we live in that universe, but if we did, then it would be morally important to figure out how to get over the 29-second hump on the hot stove, right? Now, leave aside questions of should and ought and duty and good and evil, let's just admit that we're in this, this is why I call it a moral landscape. We're in this space of possible experiences that admits of peaks and valleys, high spots and low spots with respect to anything that could possibly seem different from one moment to the next, that is valenced in the domain of, I use well-being as a kind of suitcase term for everything that could possibly have this character, that where something seems to matter, right? So it could matter in the sense that, okay, the pain is getting reduced, It could matter in the sense that we're experiencing beauty and creativity we weren't experiencing a moment before, and we value it. Again, we could imagine changing our values. We could imagine saying,
Raymond, I'll read,
actually, no, we really want to, we've got this. We're gonna go to Mars. We're gonna be the first people to go to Mars, and we're gonna build a community. And we want to be really different than who we were on Earth, and we want to be different from, we just want to be more or less unrecognizable to the people we used to be. So we're going to we have a completed science of the mind. We're going to change lots of things about ourselves, and we're going to want different things, right? Okay. And so we could be, the cartoon version of this, I think I give in the book, is you could imagine an island of, perfectly matched sadists and masochists, right? Who just, I can't imagine sadomasochism actually works this way, but just imagine it did, where you could just have people who were being cruel.
I actually also don't like when people take on spiritualism completely out of the equation. You can believe how the world came to be however you like, but I think especially in the field of morality, it can be described on its own. But for the most part, it's accompanied by mention of religion. Yeah, so essentially, the question that Sam Harris asks and the position that he takes, more or less, is about, are we capable of creating our own ethic and morality?
Consequences, asshole.
I almost had you, bro. But for the most part, it's kind of by the mention of religion. Yeah. So wow. Fuck you, bud.
Enemy mine. Hostile UAV established overhead. Hostile front. Hostiles reclaimed the lead.
That's okay. Come on over here, bud. Boom. So we have ethics and we have morality. We have ethics, which are the overarching structure, and then you have morality, which is like the relationship between the two is sorry, I'm having a hard time fucking focusing right now. Yeah, right.
They're cooked.
Ah, fuck off. Gotcha.
You're supposed to be the CIA's best. Act like it.
No. There's too much going on right there. Really?
Work out what went wrong and fix it. Time to stop the bleeding. RTB, we're done.
Oh. Tell me I got the best play though. Let's go. Mr. Lazy.
You didn't think I'd let that go, did ya?
Not when people take God and spiritualism completely out of the equation. You can believe how the world came to be however you like, but I think especially in the field of morality, it can be described on its own. But for the most part, it's accompanied by mentioning religion. To act without charity. Have you not Gurok, I don't know what that means today. Have I not eaten today? I don't know. So, it's not unreasonable to have those two things separated. I argue that the only if what we're saying is that a human being is capable of generating their own morality, their own system of ethics, I don't think you can get away from the fact that that was informed over the thousands of years of religious practice, pre-science, right? So then you have the advent of science, you move away from religion, and say, no, we can still create our own ethical structures. But I don't know. Secular society is... No, I haven't. I just woke up not too long ago. So anyway, yeah. I don't think you can... You can meaningfully separate the two, but like I'm fine with the argument that a rational person should know the difference between right and wrong. I get that, but I can't see us meaningfully. What the fuck, bro?
Sniper's history.
Sniper.
They've taken the lead.
I just don't think you can.
The lead is ours. You're falling behind.
What? Nah, I had that guy beat. Get fucking
Cool and being made miserable, but they really were finding this incredibly rewarding because of just the kinds of minds they have. They have this sort of S&M reward function.
Stuck him.
That's conceptually possible from my point of view. And I'm willing to stipulate it might be unrecognizable to me. It might be even odious to me, given my moral intuitions. But it's conceivable we live in a universe where something that strange, from my point of view, could nevertheless be a peak on another peak on a moral landscape, right? Different from the one I'm attempting to ascend.
Sure.
Yeah.
There's so much to say. I mean, the first is this idea of beginning with getting rid of all duty, should. Just forget about that for a minute, and let's just look at the world we're in. Suppose we're having a conversation with somebody in that world, right? They're just in this descriptive world. There's no ought, there's no should, there's no duty. And
no ought, no should, no
we say to them, look, notice what happens when you put your hand on a hot stove. And this person puts their hand on the stove and they pull it away. And you say, see, you didn't like that, did you? And they go, no, I really didn't like that. It really hurt. And you say, so you value, not having your hand hurt in that way. And they're like, yeah, so I suppose I do. I mean, I put my hand on and it just happens. And I then say to them this statement. So look, if we should do anything in this life, and they go, hold on, what do you mean should? What is that? What are you talking about? I say, look, if we should do anything, it should be, avoiding those kind of circumstances. And they just say to you, we're in this world where should doesn't exist. What are you talking about there?
I don't think we should draw much of anything from this failure of persuasion, because again, it is like the creationists at the physics conference. But
well, it's not so much. I see what you're saying there, but what I mean to say is I'm trying to get out what you actually mean in that phrase when you say if we should do anything. What do you mean by that word?
I'm saying the universe would be better, all things considered. So let's just say we couldn't. Let's say we all have enough brain damage on this point where the sense of should is just something we can never seem to justify, and we're all kind of radically selfish. Whereas even if I can tell you that you would be better off not having your hand on a hot stove, I can't get you to care that anyone else not burn, say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, certain things follow. One is given what it is to have a human mind and human relationships, given how social we are, given what given certain positive states of mind that are on offer, like love and compassion, you'll see this person unable to have certain experiences that we also recognize are sources of happiness, even our primary sources of happiness, right? So they're going to be cognitively and emotionally closed to really loving their kids if they can't figure out how the universe is better, or to care that it be better not having their kids tortured, right? If they only care about their torture, they're limited in and there are consequences to that limitation.
When you say the word better there, because I asked what do you mean by should, and you said something like that the world would be better. What do you mean by better? In precisely
the same way that it's better for them, in the way that they acknowledge that their hand's not going to be on the hot stove. It's better for their kids not to be tortured in the same way, even if just viewed from above, not a personal view, just viewed in the totality of things.
I suppose my problem is, if that is the case, then in the same way that you can essentially just translate words like good into, talking about well-being, I can do the same thing in the opposite direction and translate words like value into things like preference. So if I say something like, look, you put that hand on that stove and you take it away, all that tells me is that I prefer it not to be that way. And I could say that I can convince this person that the world would be better if not. And what do you mean by better? Well, I mean better in the same way that you take your hand away. That is, you would prefer it to be that way.
Yeah, or someone else would prefer it, yeah.
And that's fine. But now it seems like what we're doing is if that is the language that we use, we're saying that the world would be better. This is a good thing to do. Just means this would be a way that people prefer it. And that's fine, but that means that we're talking about moral subjectivity. That's essentially a definition of moral subjectivity, right? That to say good is to say this is what people just prefer.
No, I mean, it's only, I'll grant you that the term preference is deflationary, but it's only deflationary because we reserve it for things that don't really matter, right? The moment you make things matter more and more and more and more and more, and you get into the territory of the worst possible misery for everyone versus its antithesis, some sublime state of satisfaction that endures for as long as possible for everyone capable of it. And the difference, the gulf that opens up between those two states of the universe or any, microcosm within that universe, that gulf is not, to traverse that gulf is with the term preference is just, it seems like a misuse of how we use that term, right? It only seems deflationary because of what we do with it. But yes, it's what matters, the fact of mattering, the objective fact of anything mattering is a subjective reality. I'll grant you that. I mean, this is the split between...
We got wiped out.
Quick smoke break. Oh, fuck. Be right back.
Eat this.
All right. Oh, fuck. Hold on a second. Just wanted something to write on and something to write with. We got on the docket for today, Raymond.
Ontological and subjectivity and objectivity. It's not a matter for rocks and quasars. It's a matter for conscious systems to notice the difference in, right? So without consciousness, the world of value goes away, right? It's got to matter to someone, somewhere, somehow, at least possibly, right? So if it's, I would grant that it could potentially affect an experience as opposed to actually affect an experience and still matter. But if there's something out there that couldn't possibly affect anyone's experience, now or in the future, no matter what happens, well, then that thing doesn't matter, right? But by definition, in my world. Yeah, I mean, so it's not a bug of my view. Rather, it's a feature that it captures what we care about, in my view, in when we talk about right and wrong, good and evil.
Yeah.
And I think it does. You can talk about should and duty, but those are
chilling at home.
I will grant it's not a lot hinges on whether that strand of the conversation succeeds for me. It's because one of the entailments of my view is that we really are radically ignorant as to what is possible and what is real ultimately. Even one of the knocks against consequentialism and utilitarianism, which I admit, and it's profoundly inconvenient, is that it's very difficult to know when to stop gathering data so as to judge any act to be good or evil. So it's like, is Putin's invasion of Ukraine bad or good? Well, I certainly think it's bad. I'm reacting as though it's bad. I'm condemning him as though it's bad. I think he has bad intentions. I think he's a bad person. I think there's a lot of evidence for that. But what if the invasion of Ukraine and all the misery endured there by the Ukrainians and all the needless destruction of life and property somehow does something to world affairs that 30 years from now we recognize, okay, that was actually the thing that got us to get our heads screwed on straight.
Well, it's the hand on the stove for 30 seconds.
Yeah,
bringing
and everything got better
pleasure
after that, right? So it's actually, it was, in hindsight, it was the best thing that happened in 500 years. Right now, I have no reason to think that's true. I would highly doubt anyone suspecting that that is true, but I can't rule out that possibility, right? So that's contained in this analysis, right? So the thing that really confounds people, and it's the thing that is just a perpetual engine of misunderstanding of my view, is that people immediately move to the claims I'm making about moral truth to an effort to adjudicate practical moral decisions that exist very much in the gray area of, there are trade-offs and calculations we can't do, and who knows what in the final analysis is really morally true. What's going to be better for any individual or the greatest number of individuals? And this comes to the distinction I make in the book around answers in practice and answers in principle, right? So what I'm saying is that there are answers in principle, ultimately, at the end of the conversation, a billion years from now, where we can say, we can cash out our truth claims as being real, right? Or having been real. There might not be answers in practice, and yet, again, this is a double standard in science. There are an infinite number of questions for which we don't have answers in practice, and yet no one would be tempted to say there's no truth there.
Of course, yeah. How many stars are there in the Milky Way precisely?
Exactly.
Who knows?
Yeah, and what is their weight? And it's just changed, right?
For what it's worth, I mean, all of this is fine in that
right.
There seems to sort of be two steps in the moral landscape enterprise here. One is good is about well-being. That's step one. And step two is once we grant that, we can make all kinds of scientific claims. Right. And this is where it becomes relevant to talk about how people will object, but you can't know in practice, but there is a principal answer. All of that stuff, I'm totally with you on. Like everything on that side, I completely agree. It doesn't matter that we can't know in practice, whether we should cure cancer or racism. Like that doesn't matter. There could be a right
But that's the
answer.
kind of pushback I get even from moral philosophers. They'll say, well, I don't know how to measure well-being, right?
Sure,
Like,
yeah.
give me a device. But so look, I hear that you're concerned about the definition of well-being and that it's not precise and that it couldn't be precise.
It's not that it's not precise. It's that I suppose, and I'll be interested to see what you think of this. When you've spoken to Daniel Dennett about free will,
right?
And most people listening will probably be familiar. You don't believe in free will. Daniel Dennett is a compatibilist. He believes that there is free will, and you've had sort of a lot of back and forth about it. And one of the things that happened in this debate is Daniel Dennett puts forward this thing, which he says, look, I can... The actions that I'm performing, they come from somewhere within me. They're due to my will, all of this kind of stuff. And so that's freedom. And you accused him of something that I think you coined as the Atlantis fallacy. Mm-hmm. You said, look, you're describing this thing and you're saying, if free will means anything, surely it's got to mean like something to do with the action not being inhibited by exterior forces, it coming from somewhere in my brain, this kind of stuff. And because it fulfills all of those criteria, it's free will. And you say, this is a bit like saying, you're trying to prove the existence of Atlantis. And you say, here's this city, and it's watery, and it's old, but you're actually pointing at Venice. And you say, but what is this Atlantis that you're talking about? Atlantis is a sort of slight, it's this watery city, it's really old. Like, it fulfills some of the criterion, sure, but it's not what people mean when they say Atlantis, right? And that's the criticism you've made of Daniel Dennett. Now,
he's changing the subject. Yeah.
What I want to do is make the same criticism here of you, that you're doing the Atlantis fallacy with ethics, where you say, look at this thing called well-being. It seems intimately connected to things that we value. It seems intimately connected to all sort of forms of moral systems that people have devised. Despite what they might claim is the basis of ethics, it's always got something to do with well-being. And you're pointing at this thing called well-being and saying this fulfills so many criteria. And that's the equivalent of you pointing to Venice and me saying, sure, it does do that, but when people say Atlantis, they mean something else. And when people say good, they just mean something else.
Yeah, so that's I would be happy to dispute that. It's because in Dan's case, I can point to what he's leaving out. Right, he's leaving out something I think crucial. He is in fact changing the subject. Here, my definition of well-being, again, it's not a definition. It's just tell me what matters to you. Tell me what I'm leaving out. Tell me, and so if you're a fundamentalist Christian, you'll say, well, for me, it's all about this world doesn't matter at all. Really, it's just a matter of who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. Right? It's just following God's law. Well, that's just another circumstance of suffering and its antithesis. Right? It's you're concerned about your conscious life beyond the grave. Now, you might be wrong. In fact, you very likely are wrong about whether Christianity is correct, in about the physics of things. But let's say you're right. Well, then I'll grant you, nothing's more important than not winding up in hell, right?
Sure.
So
but the way you would just like, well, tell me what you value. If it's not well-being, what is it?
Tell me what I'm leaving out. What could I be leaving out?
Well,
so
I do.
Virtue.
I do value well-being. I do. I suppose what I'm saying is I just think that is a subjective preference that I have. I just have this subjective preference for my own well-being, and.
But I want to follow the move you just made with respect to Dan. You're saying that my definition of well-being, however capacious, is guaranteed to leave out what some people legitimately mean by good or evil or etc.
Yeah.
So what are those things?
Well, I think the tricky thing is, and I can offer a few different answers from different, I guess, moral perspectives. I mean, I'm an emotivist about ethics, so I don't have what I would say is whatever that gap is, I think just doesn't exist. But some people might say, for example, when you speak to a religious person and you say, what do you value if not well-being, or what is missing from that picture, they might say something like, well, yes, the worst possible misery for everyone is bad, and that there's no way of conceiving of that situation that wouldn't be bad. But it's not bad just because of, say, the suffering. It might be the case, for example, that you're an Aristotelian, and you think that things have natural ends. This table's end is to hold things up, and a human's end is to fulfill whatever, the human end is. And suffering doesn't fulfill that. But they'll say that the reason that it's bad is because suffering doesn't fulfill the natural end of man or something. It's not because it's suffering. It's not because the experience of suffering is something that the creatures who feel it subjectively don't like. And so they'll totally agree with you that, yeah, the worst possible misery for everyone is bad, but that isn't enough to show me that it's bad because it involves the suffering, And so they'll say that what you're missing there is that. Now, I wouldn't say that because I'm not an Aristotelian, but then I wouldn't say that this good concept exists objectively, right? And so I'd be the wrong person to ask. But I think it would be something like that, right? And you must recognize that, at least on the surface, when you tell people, I think morality is about well-being, and they sort of meet you with suspicion, that there must be something about this word good, even if they can't quite pin down what it is, that means more than just that.
Yeah, well, so I'll grant you that people have different associations with all of these terms, and many of those associations are confusing. I mean, they make it's very easy to misunderstand what I'm saying if you have a fairly effete conception of well-being or happiness. Or, I mean, they don't sound like substantial terms. It sounds like when you're thinking about what spa you want to go to on the weekend, then you're thinking about your well-being. But when your kid's getting tortured in the next room, well-being is not the framing that makes sense. But I'm using well-being and even a lighter term like happiness versus suffering to run as deep as we can possibly go, and deeper than that if we only had minds that could go deeper than that, right? So it's just, again, I'm willing to dispense with the conventional terminology in order to just reset the conversation and descriptively explore this space of all possible experience, right? So what are the concepts? If you don't like words like good and evil, how do you want to think about a space where you individually and we collectively as conscious beings have a navigation problem, right? Well, like where morality is essentially the demand that is being imposed on us by reality, the reality that we are as conscious beings and whatever reality in which we're entangled. The demand is being made on us at each moment to do or not do something next, right? Like we're continually tacking in some unseen wind and experiencing the results of that movement.
Yeah.
And we're, you could imagine beings like ourselves where they have a very different language. The conceptual layer that applied to this navigation could be very different, and it might not be easy to translate our moral talk into their talk about these changes. Right?
Maybe you can tell me what I'm missing from my picture then, because like I say, I'm broadly speaking an ethical emotivist. But
say more about the consequences of that. What does that mean?
I'm not sort of, I don't know, I always like to be a little bit agnostic about these things, open to change and all that, but I'm broadly attracted to this view that when we make ethical statements or pronouncements, we're essentially just expressing emotions at each other. And so when I say that murder is wrong, I'm sort of expressing some kind of distaste, or I'm expressing something akin to saying, don't do that, which is just like a command. It doesn't have any truth value. It's not even subjectively true or false. It's just like a command or an expression. And so if that's the case, then this sort of ethical talk is completely different to the picture that you're painting. And so,
no, not really. I can translate some of that into the picture I'm painting, because again, it sounds like to say that it's just a statement about the way we feel or might feel.
Well, it's not. To be clear, it's not a statement about how we feel. It is the expression of the feeling. So the mistake that's often made with the motivism is when I say murder is wrong, I'm not saying something like I don't like murder or I feel bad towards murder, because that can be true and false. As we were discussing earlier, it can be true that I don't like murder. It's the expression of the dislike to the murder. So Aya famously has it as just going, boo, murder. That's not something that has any kind of truth value. And
boo doesn't, but you're granting that it is possible to not like murder, and that could be an objective state of a subjective system.
Yeah, that's
right?
that's no problem at all.
Yeah,
sure.
Okay.
And so I find myself in a world where I put my hand on a hot stove, and when I do, I go, I don't like that. And it's objectively true that I don't like that. Cool. And so I look around the world, and there are certain experiences that are going to make me suffer and some that are not. And so I pick the ones that don't make me suffer because I prefer them. And like, that's it, man. That's the story.
Okay, let's build from there. So that's you as the emotivist, picking and choosing in the space of possible experience. Would you grant that there are experiences you haven't had and you don't know what you're missing?
Yes, in terms of what I would, if experiencing those, subjectively enjoy. Sure.
Right. So, and it might be, there are circumstances where, or there are experiences that are available to people and, other conscious minds, but they're not available to you given how you are, right? So you might not have the talent required to get there, or the genes required to get you there. Or
Absolutely, no problem with that.
Okay, so the landscape of possible experience extends what you currently know or even can know, right? And that's true of every person
Absolutely,
like you. And now we're saying boo at each other in that context.
And this landscape we're talking about is a landscape of experiences, either possible or actual, which if I were to experience them, I would go, yay. I'd go, yeah, sure, great.
But the yay, the thumbs up and thumbs down can be increasingly strident, right? I mean, like there are experiences that are so good.
Absolutely.
That you'll have the experience of everything that's happened up to me, up to this moment in my life, it was comparatively worthless compared to this experience that I'm now having.
Sure.
Right? And obviously the opposite is the case. So what do you make of the fact that these experiences exist, right? And they're radically different, and that there are right and wrong answers with respect to how to get from one to the other. It's not, you don't randomly get just hurled toward one or the other.
Sure.
There are, at every level that we can understand ourselves scientifically, from the genome on up, so genetics and neuroscience and psychology and sociology, if that were actually a science, economic systems, everything, every contribution to a possible change in the character of our experience can be more or less well understood.
Absolutely.
Rationally.
Yeah, no problem with that either.
Okay. So all those converging lines of fact-based discussion can be brought to bear on this navigation problem.
Yeah.
Right.
So because I've got this subjective preference to reach this peak, I can use all of the scientific resources available to me to go and reach that peak.
Okay, now what if we just add one other element to this, which is you've got your preference weights such as they are now, you got the factory settings, but you didn't pick your parents, you didn't pick your genes, you didn't pick the factory, you didn't pick your culture and the world into which you were born, and you've been tuned up by forces beyond your control.
Yep.
Now we have something like a completed science of the mind, and you can actually change your preferences.
Okay.
Right, and there's this additional question of whether whether you should do that, whether that would be a good thing to do, but good as measured by what?
Well, in my universe, we don't have terms like good yet. That hasn't entered into the
so
picture yet.
you'll just say boo differently if we change those weights, right?
So let's say like somebody offers me the opportunity to take a pill, and let's say that in this world I don't really like music that much.
Right.
So I don't really care for it, whatever. And I can take a pill that's suddenly going to turn me into this great music lover where I'm going to experience this brand new joy. And although right now my preference isn't to enjoy music, so it doesn't seem to matter to me, I can change my preferences so that now this new pleasure opens up to me and I can experience it. What would I do? I'd look at that pill and I'd go, yeah, sounds great, awesome. And I'd take the pill just because I would prefer to have that preference. It's a second order preference, right? But there's still no space here into which has entered a concept of like moral prescription, of goodness, of ought. I'm still just in this world where there are experiences I prefer, and I use my scientific analysis of the world to achieve those. And when something comes along that allows me to really radically improve that feeling of subjective preference, hell yeah, use all the science you can get to give me those pills.
Right.
But still no moral judgments here, right?
Well, there are potentially, but they might not be necessary. I mean, like, as long as you're going to concede that you might not know what you're missing, if you might not know how good life could be if you only made certain changes to yourself or to your thinking or to your culture, right? So we have a bunch of people like you who just don't want to talk about shoulds and oughts, right? And they never do. They just occasionally they say boo, but they don't think anything really hangs on it. And then if we, it could be an empirical fact about you and your or people like you, that you're cognitively and emotionally and culturally and civilizationally closed to certain outcomes, which are available the moment you begin to play a little bit differently.
I'm not sure why those would be correlated, because like this idea that, you know, there are experiences that are available to me that I don't even know what I'm missing. That doesn't require me to believe in any concept of morality, because if you said to me,
I'm still just on the so again I'm bracketing morality, you know, the judgmental, you know, valence of that term for the purpose of this part of the conversation. I'm just saying that this descriptively we're in kind of in the descriptive still value laden landscape of this feels much better than this over here, which I never want to taste or touch again, right?
Crucially, just for clarity, I would say, in my view here, this is subjective value. These are
it's
subjectively
subjective.
valued.
These are objective facts about conscious systems.
Objective facts about how to best achieve what one subjectively values.
Yeah, but that turn doesn't do anything deflationary for me. It's just there are certain things that only exist as appearances in consciousness, right? That is their ontological status, right? There's no, even if we could later correlate them with other states of the physics of things, it's just, you can't conceptually reduce them. You can't. There's no the there is as conscious experiences, right? And I would say consciousness itself is one of those things. It's just that the only evidence for consciousness in this universe is as consciousness, right? It's like there's no evidence in a brain that consciousness is a thing, right?
Okay. So is there something from this picture that we've been painting so far, where I've started in a world, I don't know why I'm imagining like I'm on some desert island, like we're starting from scratch, you know, like the opening Minecraft game or something. I'm just here in this world, and there are things I prefer and things that I don't, and I start to learn scientifically through observation which things are going to get me what I want and which things aren't. So I start acting in accordance. Then we all get together, and because it's going to be good for me if I work with this person, we work together and we start developing maybe this pill, and then somebody comes over on a boat and says, hey, there's this great thing that you don't even know that you're missing, you know, give it a go. And I'm so open-minded that I'm like, yeah, it sounds awesome, and the pleasures are just increasing and increasing all the time. And again, like, the end, you know, end scene, story's over. That's the picture for me.
Right.
What? Because if it is the case that there are in fact moral values in the world, like there is this thing called objective moral truth. The picture I've just painted, as far as I can see, doesn't contain it. So,
I
what's
think it does.
wrong about that picture? Where's it gone wrong?
No, the more we fill in the blank spots in that picture, the more I think we get everything we could conceivably want by any talk about right and wrong, good and evil. So I mean, just give yourself a desert island and maybe, you know, add another person. So, you know, you're Adam and Eve, right? And you're building the world anew, and then the question is, again, there's just two of you, and you have a navigation problem even there, right? And you would even have a navigation problem alone, but let's make it a little more complex. So there's two of you, and now the question is, how can you live so as to maximize everything that would be rewarding, good, yum, I want more of that.
Yeah. Well, that is what they would in fact be doing, but there would be no.
Okay, but again, the crucial thing to admit is that there are right and wrong answers. That there are very real and very different possibilities in the space of all possible experience that can be actualized. There's some they couldn't possibly get to in a normal human lifespan because two people is just not enough to get you those things, right? But you know there's a range of right and more wrong answers open to them as to how to maximize what I'm calling their well-being, right? And the first answer is they could both pick up large rocks and start smashing each other in the face, right? Now, that would be a bad answer to this. It's a possible answer. It will give them some immediate feedback as to what life is like when you do that.
Be the wrong way to get there well.
Wrong way. And it just closes the door to other kinds of collaboration that we know are going to be objectively better. If better means navigating away from the worst possible misery for everyone and towards something, or in your emotivist terms, fewer booze and more yums, just getting
I didn't even see him.
the character of experience will change, and will change by virtue of whatever laws of nature underwrite the character of conscious experience, right? And
That's right.
Again, we can understand those laws at every level that we attempt to understand anything, from genetics on up. Right?
It sounds to me like, Adam and Eve in that world, the color example comes to mind again, and maybe I'm missing something as to why this isn't a challenge, but they just are looking around the Garden of Eden, and they just discover that yellow just is really nice. They just like it. And so then they discover that there are all of these scientific ways to figure out how to get more yellow. They figure out like botany. They figure out that you can plant particular plants and we'll get more yellow in the world. Like, great, but this seems to me just two Homo sapiens acting in accordance with their preferences. If somebody tried to import moral terms into this botany of planting flowers because they're yellow and we prefer yellow, I'd say that's a bit strange. And then that person could go on this incredible and intricate demonstration of the surprising and incredible ways that science can inform us about how we can enjoy colors in ways that we never even imagined. Like there's so much more to it than we even really considered.
Yeah.
But I would then say, yeah, sure, that's great, but what's this morality thing that you're talking about in accord? I mean, again, talking to the Adam and Eve character here, they're like, no, I just like these flowers. Well, what do you mean morality? What is this thing that you're talking about?
Yeah, but the only place where we're tempted to kind of turn up the volume of our sort of discursive insistence and use really judgmental terms like good and evil, right and wrong, is when the difference between the preference, when the preferences are beginning to track something that matters more and more and more, and it such that it eclipses a concern about anything else, right? And that's why the hot stove is like, when your hand is on a hot stove, you really can't care about anything else, right? I mean, that's, if you can care about something else, then it's not hot enough, right? And so it only becomes torture, it only becomes a moral evil, it only becomes something more than just a preference when it becomes unendurable, right? Or just so significant as to eclipse anything else. And I still think we can decline to make those moves. We can keep trying to deflate it and saying, well, it really is still, at bottom, it really is just a preference for a conscious being like yourself not to be burnt alive, right? But I just don't see what we're doing there. I mean, there's one thing I want to add here, which may help untangle this, is that there's another double standard here, or disparity in how we talk about shoulds in the moral sphere. So like I say that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad, and if we should do anything, we should avoid it, right? And everything is objectively better than the worst possible misery for everyone. And you could say, well, yeah, but who's to say you should? Yeah, who's to say that it's really true that you ought to see that the worst possible misery for everyone is worse than some other state of the universe where there's lots of happy people? And like, why? Like, how is that? How does should and ought apply there? So I mean, you could do the same thing in logical or mathematical space. You could say that 2 + 2 = 4, and if someone fails to understand that, you could say, well, when you add 2 and 2, you should get 4, right? You ought to get 4. You actually have a logical duty or an arithmetical duty to get 4. Right, and if you don't get 4, you're shirking this responsibility. I mean, you could add that layer of judgmentalism. But that
seems to me like kind of what you're doing. If forgive me, but it seems like when someone says, well,
Well, I'm saying it's not a problem to strip out that layer of judgmentalism in our talk about right and wrong and good and evil. About
well, if somebody says 1 and 1 makes 2, and you said like, look, 1 and 1 should make 2, and I said, I don't know why you're using the should language.
We don't.
Does make
we don't.
2, right?
Yeah.
And
the worst possible misery for everyone is something we should move away from.
Whereas I would say
but
it's just something that people do move away
exactly.
from.
But in arithmetically, 2 plus 2 just does make 4.
And people just do move away from the worst possible misery,
exactly.
right?
Yes, and there is no. It's definitional. If you wouldn't want to move away from it, and you want anything, it's not the worst possible misery.
I totally agree. But notice how, like, if that's the case, because look at that, we agree on something. We just do move away from suffering. We just do get 2 and we add 1 and 1. If you said to me,
again, a little caveat here, nothing turns on it, but this is not pure. It's not a pure pleasure principle. I mean, there's all kinds of suffering we do move toward because they're deep. We recognize that there's deeper happiness and things we want on the other side of it. Yeah,
so that's why it's helpful to talk about the worst possible misery,
right?
Even conceivably.
Yeah.
Sure. So people just do move away from it, and when you add 1 and 1, you just do get 2.
Right.
If you turn around to me and said, "Well, I'm just going to start talking in this language of should," I'm just going to say, if you add 1 and 1, you should get 2. And what I mean by that is essentially a moral prescription.
No. Again,
I'd find that really weird.
The difference. So, I think you're taking the wrong end of this thing, or the opposite of what I'm trying to illustrate. I hear you making my point. What I'm saying is that this should talk, this ought talk that people think is intrinsic to morality, I think is grafted on in the same way that I'm now grafting on in a seemingly ridiculous way, this judgmentalism with respect to logic.
Right. So you're saying that people...
I'm saying it just is better.
People generally do this should thing. They just add the should factor when they're just talking about the description.
If there was a button here that we could push at no cost to ourselves that would reduce the misery of human beings on Earth by half, and let's just stipulate that there's no other unforeseen negative consequences that occur as a result of that. But just like consequentially, this is just better. Everyone who's miserable gets, much less miserable, and no cost to ourselves, we can push the button. So what does it mean to say we really should push that button right now? That's one way of talking about it. I would agree. For shorthand, it's fine. I say should all the time, right? But I'm saying it's the world would be objectively better if we push that button. And it would be so much better that if someone understood all of the causality here and still declined to push the button, that person would be a moral monster. But again, in this area of talk where we talk about right and wrong, good and evil, and morality and should, right? Like, there'd be something wrong with that person. Because just imagine what that person would have to think and say and feel so as to decline to push that button with a clear conscience, right? Like what if we're talking about a Kim Jong-un character or somebody who we might say, well, what is it to me that all these people are suffering?
Fuck off.
And I kind of like the idea that I like the idea that there's this much of a disparity between my current happiness and so many billions of people who are really unhappy, right? And so part of my pleasure in getting out of bed in the morning is knowing that my feelings of satisfaction are at some kind of zenith with respect to to all of the background misery that I don't have to take any time to understand, but I know is there, right? So if you're telling me, if you're going to give me this button, not only would I not push it, I would want another button where I could, further immiserate people, right? Well, that's what we mean by evil. That's what and we know the reason why that person is worse off than other people, from my point of view, with respect to the moral landscape, is that we know that to be that sort of person is to almost by definition not be available to certain states of consciousness that we all agree are some of the most important and beautiful and creative states of consciousness on offer, insofar as we can see it. Right now, I'll grant you there could be some very weird spot on the moral landscape where you get, perfect sadists and perfect masochists, etc. So things could get weird, and there's some description of the laws of nature that would make sense of that. But the crucial point for me is that even if there are other high spots on the landscape that are weird, there are many spots on the landscape that are not high, no matter who you are, no matter what you want, no matter how we tune all the relevant variables, they just suck, right? There are low spots. And again, these are objective claims about conscious minds now and in the future, however they're constituted.
Yeah.
Right.
I really want to dig into this, my pleasure, good for me, versus other people's pleasure or well-being being something that's morally... that ought to be morally preferred. Just before moving on to that, I want to say that it sounds to me, just to wrap this section up, because it's weird. I think we almost agree in that me being an emotivist and just thinking that all there essentially is people's preferences and people acting in accordance with them. It almost sounds like you agree with me, and this whole thing about tacking on the should.
Well, but
correct me if I'm wrong.
Should is shorthand for a lot that we know about human minds and human societies that deeply matters to us, right? We know quite a bit about the difference between the best possible lives and the best possible relationships and the worst possible, right? And so, and insofar, the shorthand is,
Fuck off.
if you could push that button, you really should do it, right? In fact, you should be willing to pay a fair amount of money to do it, right? Like, you should be able to. You should be willing to make some sacrifice personally to do it. And if I'm talking to someone who says, "Well, I don't see any of that," right? I don't see why I should even just lift a finger to do that, right? There may not be. I think there probably are ways to argue that person, closer toward pushing the button if they're, neurologically intact.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah,
You could say, "Oh, did you consider the fact that there are people who might be miserable right now, whose misery would be reduced, and there are people who you might meet tomorrow, who you might fall in love with, your future wife who's out there, who you're going to meet 6 months from now, she might be in a depression right now, and you could alleviate that." There are ways to triangulate on even the most obtuse person, but there are people who will have essentially kicked themselves loose of any rational conversation about that we want to summarize with words like should. And then they might pretend to be, to be living in some kind of moral solitude and not see why anything gets better if things get better outside their own consciousness. But it's pretty easy to see that they do, even by their own lights. I mean, this is where even like Kantian analysis seems to track the same terrain, where it's like, Kant acknowledged that, even a thief couldn't want thievery to be a categorical imperative, because then everyone would be stealing from him, and there'd be no advantage to being a thief. I mean, so there's things universalize whether you're thinking in those terms or not. And
but it all seems to sort of translate into terms of preference here.
But see, you're using the word preference as though it really took the air out of the balloon. What does it mean to say that you have a preference for not spending every conscious moment, you and everyone you love, and everyone who you might come to love, spending every conscious moment now and through any possible future, the longest possible future, perhaps a future that we could engineer to be much far longer than is naturally possible now, not suffering the worst possible misery?
I think it literally just means that I would be happier in the knowledge that wasn't happening.
Well, it's not happier in the knowledge.
It is in the knowledge when you're talking about other people. But even technically for me, like if I can't suffer without knowing I suffer. But okay, I said that as a technicality because if all of my friends were being tortured, but I was just being lied to about it, I just didn't know, then of course I'm not going to be any more upset for that. That's just a sort of technicality that I'm making. But presuming that I'm correct about what I know about the world, like you're asking, what does it mean for me to say that I would prefer not to just suffer immeasurably for the rest of time? What it means is that I would be happier if that didn't happen, if that weren't the case. I think that is literally just what...
Well, that's circular, because happier imports the notion of preference on your account too.
Perhaps.
But for me, this isn't a problem,
all
because
definitions are circular to a degree.
It's a brute fact about conscious systems. Again, you could do something like, you could say, 2 + 2 makes 4, just because you could put that in preferential terms as well. You could say, well, that's just the way it seems to me. right? It's like that's the way I can't see it any other way. You know, you as a logician, you could simply say, you could subjectivize everything. You could say, it's just the way it seems to me. You know, and what work does that do? That is in fact true. I mean, if you want to be radically skeptical about everything and bracket everything,
I have defended that view elsewhere. That essentially we can emotivize everything, and so rather than, let's say, pulling up, subjective ethics into the realm of objectivity, we just pull the realm of objectivity down to the subjective realm that most people put ethics in. I mean. Is that something like what you're doing then? Just saying?
Well, I'm just saying they're on all fours.
Yeah, sure.
Because first of all, everything is happening in and as consciousness, right? I mean, there's no like, so consciousness, on my account, is the one thing in this universe that can't be an illusion, right? Because to say that it might be an illusion is to invoke consciousness just as fully as any veridical impression does. I mean, like to say that this is all hallucination is only the way things seem. Well, it's the fact of seeming. It announces the truth of consciousness as much as anything else, right? So it could be a simulation, this could be a dream, I could be a brain in a vat. None of that actually undercuts the reality of consciousness as I'm defining it and as I believe everyone's experiencing it. So there's nothing, if you're going to keep pushing this analysis further and further and depriving our terms of the gravitas they seem to have in ordinary language games, you are going to wind up with something like a radical, mystical skepticism that privileges consciousness first above everything else and only admits the seemings that seem to have pragmatic utility in physics or in medicine or in economics or in morality. But again, everything is going to be, there's not this disjunction of we've got science and rational and mathematics and our rational bedrock here, and then over here at some far more confected stage of the conversation, the stage where it's really just a bunch of parochial, not altogether true, certainly not scientific biases, where we talk the talk of boo and applause. That's where we talk about good and evil and right and wrong. That is that separation that I'm undercutting in the moral landscape. If you're going to grant me that everything is on all fours, where we're talking about how things seem, right? And in every time we try to give our seeming some kind of weight, we're left pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. So if you're Gödel, you're saying, well, you can't even get arithmetic without presupposing something that's true that can't be self-justifying within the domain of arithmetic, right? Yep. If you're going to grant all of that, and you're going to at the physics conference, you're going to say, yeah, well, we just happen to want the way we feel. It's our preference to understand the behavior of matter and energy, but we can't really say that's really physics. Maybe there's a totally different physics, right? If you're going to deflate everything equally, well, then it's all the same. I think we're doing a lot of work that isn't necessary. I think it's fine to use the moral shorthand of should.
Can it be cashed out in those terms when it comes to the laws of logic or mathematical truths, where it seems natural for me to say of the worst possible misery that I prefer it not to be the case. It just seems so much more unnatural.
Doesn't it sound psychotic to say that? Psychotic or psychopathic? Like either you're not tracking. I mean, just imagine, you're held by your captors in a room away from your family, and but you can hear the screams of your family in the next room. And they say to you, you want us to stop torturing your family because you just give us the information that we know you have. And you say, well, I obviously have a preference that you not torture my family as you're doing right now. But I mean, like that aloofness from the details of what's actually happening.
Well, I don't think I would put it so.
But it doesn't actually track the way you would feel and would be right to feel given the kind of being you are, given the circumstance.
Like I would really, really, really prefer for that not to happen.
Even more like how much ice cream could
could they
counterweight that preference?
Well, I suppose even I don't know. Maybe there would be an answer to that. I'm not sure. It's hard to know until you've been in that scenario, I suppose. It sounds great. But look, I mean, people say this about all kinds of things. They say it sounds absolutely absurd to say to look at the majesty of the universe and say there's no God. It just seems like crazy. And you're one of the people who's better than anyone else at looking at situations like that and going, yeah, but like forget about how it seems. If this is how it is, then this is how it is.
Yeah, but that's not a good analogy because yes, I can get there. You look up at Andromeda, that Hubble Deep Field movie that somebody made. And you can say that, but you have to just keep aggregating the data. You also have to include smallpox killing 500 million people over the course of the 20th and probably 19th century. That's part of the majesty too.
Yeah, but
right?
okay, so
what kind of God is that?
On the surface of it, it seems
What the
like,
fuck?
hey, that's crazy to say that, but if we look at it more deeply, then we'll realize it's not so crazy. And I think the same thing's true here. Like if I'm, a captive, and I say, and I was somehow in the state of mind to actually reflect in a second order sense on what was actually going on in my brain, then I would notice that when I just instinctively say, please, I'll do anything, let me go, I need you to let me go and let my family go. If I were able to stop and reflect on that, then looking at all the data, I'd realize that what's really being expressed there is a really intense preference. In the same way that if I held your hand on a stove, I think that you wanting to take that away is a preference. It's you saying, I would prefer it to be the case that my hand were not on the stove. Now, if I hold your hand there so that that preference gets incredibly intense, I still think it's true that you would just prefer your hand not to be there. I don't think it sounds, psychopathic to say that that's all that's going on, just because we've sort of turned the heat up.
But that's why I think this term preference, I mean, it strikes the ear as radically diminishing of the significance of the thing. But if we're just going to expand it to encompass everything that matters as much as it could possibly matter to us or to any conscious system, well, then it's a different word, but I'm fine with it. I mean, yes, it's a valence. It's a subjective valence with respect to how you're disposed to navigate in the space of changes, right? So you're going to do, based on your wanting more or less, based on the kind of being you are going to do something or want to do something if you're prevented from doing something. And all of that has consequences. And yes, and there are trade-offs. I mean, there may be states of the universe where, again, they're discordant, right? Which is to say, if you're on one peak, you're not on another peak. But if we could, spend 1 billion years doing all the relevant math, we would recognize, okay, everyone's kind of more or less just as well off in each circumstance, although things are different, right? These people are fixated on yellow over here. These people over here don't even think about color, but they've got something else that really captivates them. These are different. They're incommensurable. But they're given the laws of nature, and given that everything that allows for experience is emerging out of the laws of nature, there is a way to navigate between these two peaks. There's some valley we could descend into, and some ridge we could climb. That would require changes to the nervous system and changes to our intuitions and changes to our talk about morality, and there are trade-offs even within the gray areas of our own living where we don't know if we've made the right decision. And if you could even say, imagine the person who's being tortured, or imagine a person whose family is being tortured in the next room, and he has secrets that if he gives them up, he's going to ruin the world. So it would be good if he didn't care about his family being tortured, right? And if we could give him a pill at that moment that would cause him to be, truly callous with respect to the suffering of his family, that would be the right thing to do because he'd save the world and he wouldn't suffer. And yes, it's too bad about his family, but in a consequentialist calculus, you save 1 billion lives and you lose 2, and we'll take that trolley problem all day. Okay, that's a painful trade-off. It might have been the best place we collectively could have navigated to, given the circumstances. There's a place to stand where it would be better, all things considered, had his family not been captured and not been tortured. And I mean, so there's counterfactuals that we prefer, but given what happened, there might only be one place to move, and it involves a trade-off. And if you focus on the trade-off, it's truly galling, and it's awful that this man is sitting there smiling as his family's getting tortured, and he's certainly going to feel bad about it later. But it was the best thing we could do in this part of the moral landscape.
Sure, I think it'd be good to probe this bit about other people's well-being. Of course, there's so much more to say about this. Let's say the meta-ethical element. I think it's very helpful how you've talked in terms of pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. Essentially, I suppose the criticism many people are making, and one that I've made in the past, is that the philosophy is circular. Seems to me like you might be saying something like, well, it is in the way that any other kind of philosophy is circular and must be circular.
Yeah.
And,
which is to say that, I wouldn't I don't accept the charge of circularity really, but there's a first move you have to make to come out of the darkness, and that move is not itself self-justifying. And for me, the first move is you have to acknowledge that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad.
Well,
and that anything else it would be better. Right.
Even if I would charge your philosophy with circularity, perhaps the conversation shouldn't go around in circles.
But yeah, good. But like if you look at a definition of something like a cause, right? I mean, just to define the term cause, you get something like a circular definition of cause. I mean, like
I think it's true of all definitions.
Yeah.
Not
all definitions,
but
of all brute facts of our reasoning.
Let's say all foundational definitions, where you just need to sort of start with the term. There's no further recourse, right? It's kind of like how a dictionary is always going to be internally self-referential. If you try to, every word in the dictionary is defined with other words, and so if you kept sort of looking at, if you looked at the definition of table, and within that definition, you took one of the words in the definition and looked for the definition of that, and looked for the definition.
I don't think you believe that. Whenever I talk to people or dialogue with people who are defending that position, I don't honestly think you believe that.
God is the great ground of all being, but there's this idea that if you don't accept this, or if you put a foot wrong, or if you do the wrong thing, you get punished, and in such a way that even if you do it inside your own head, you have this force that can punish you for it. Doesn't that seem tyrannical to you?
Yeah, that does, but that's not the right way to look at it.
There was an episode of Family Guy where they bust into the compound and they find Osama bin Laden, and he says, "I accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior," and then yes, he's in heaven.
Right. The most important question to ask about any person is, what does that person worship? Once you know that, you'll know the rest of that person's life pretty well.
Welcome to Within Reason. My name is Alex O'Connor, and I'm excited to share with you this new project that I've been working on for quite some time now. Within Reason is a new weekly podcast that's going to go on this channel, dedicated to having long-form conversations with interesting guests. Now, you might say, Alex, you already have a podcast, the Cosmic Skeptic podcast. And you'd be right, but that podcast has been incredibly sporadic. There's only been 21 episodes ever produced over some 4 years or so of doing it. And it's just been as and when I could find a guest and be bothered to make a long-form episode. Within Reason is essentially a rebranding of that Cosmic Skeptic podcast, which means that if you're already subscribed to the Cosmic Skeptic podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and the like, then you'll already be subscribed to Within Reason. You'll notice that the podcast art and the name will simply change. If you're not, however, then please do go over to your podcast platform of choice and subscribe for the audio versions of these podcasts. So, because this is a rebrand, technically this is episode 22 of the podcast, but it's the first one under this new brand, and so I'm excited to share it with you, and I look forward to producing weekly episodes that hopefully will bring you some interest and enjoyment. My guest today is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron is the founder of the Catholic ministerial organization Word on Fire, and one of the most recognizable faces in the discussions around theism and specifically Catholicism. I debated Bishop Barron a number of years ago on the existence of God, something that was positively received, and we thought it would be a good idea to sit down again, this time to talk about meaning. And so in this episode, you can expect to hear us talk about whether we find ourselves in a crisis of meaning, and if so, why that might be the case, whether the search for meaning can be reducible to evolutionary drives to survive, the conditions for salvation, are people like Jeffrey Dahmer in heaven, and also a conversation about whether God can be described as a celestial dictator. And this episode of Within Reason is brought to you by Blinkist. 2023 could be the year that you finally decide to become more productive, a better communicator, more knowledgeable about world events and history. And a lot of this wisdom is, of course, contained in books and podcasts, but we're busy people. The Blinkist app allows you to understand the most important things from over 5,500 books and podcasts in around 15 minutes. And one of the great things about Blinkist is that you can read these insights, or blinks, but you could also listen to them because there's a wonderful audio experience that comes with the app as well. I've been listening to the blinks from Atomic Habits by James Clear, a book about how small habitual changes can have drastic effects on your overall life. And it's split up into easy to navigate parts, so you can get straight to the bits of information that you're after, or just listen to the whole thing, because after all, it's a pretty short listen, or if you prefer, a short read. And so these insights should help me to become, in 2023, a more productive and successful person. And I've got Blinkist to thank for making those ideas easy to digest. And there's even a new feature called Blinkist Connect, which allows anybody with a Blinkist premium plan to share that plan for no additional cost with another account, meaning that you can get 2 accounts for the price of 1 by simply inviting a friend, a colleague, a family member to join onto your membership, and you can have both of those accounts for the same price as 1. So, for example, if I've got a friend who's never read any Christopher Hitchens, I can send them God Is Not Great, free of charge, and they'll be able to get the key insights, and we can have a conversation about it. And not only that, but you can get 30% off a Blinkist premium membership plan using my link. That means 30% off a premium plan that can be shared across 2 premium membership accounts, and you get a 7-day free trial. All you have to do is click the link in the description or go to blinkist.com/Cosmic Skeptic and start your trial today. But with that said, please enjoy the following conversation with Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure.
It's been a while since we last spoke. We had a debate, I think, a couple of years ago on Justin Brierley's show.
Right.
And it seemed to be received quite well. I'm not sure what it was about that particular debate, but watching it back, I think that we have a slightly different approach to the question of philosophy and religion. I noticed that when you speak, you speak quite poetically and almost motivationally about faith. I try to be quite sort of cold and analytical in that discussion, but I'm hoping that today we'll be able to talk a little bit more on your terms and not have a debate, but a conversation this time. And I wanted to begin by asking you about something I've noticed, especially on the online space and amongst young people, which is an increase in the popularity of so-called self-help movement. There'll be all kinds of YouTubers and books that are sold, but also in the intellectual space, people like Jordan Peterson, a lot of their popularity is driven by the sense of meaning that they're seen to reinvigorate people's lives with.
Yeah.
And I think the most astonishing thing about this is the demand for that kind of material. It says to me that we might be living through something like a crisis of meaning. And I wondered if you shared that opinion, and if so, what you think's causing it.
Yeah, I do share that opinion. We're in such a culture of self-invention. You know, the priority is given to the ego to kind of invent its own values and even to invent itself. And the roots of that go back, go to Nietzsche, come up through Sartre and into Foucault and people like that, which has now become the default position of most young people in the West, I would say, that we invent ourselves, we invent our own values. And I think if you want to mention someone like Peterson, he's appealing to, I'd call them objective values. And a meaningful life is one that's lived in some kind of purposive relationship to a value, I would say. That when you discover, you intuit a value, whether that's epistemic or aesthetic or moral, and then you order your life according to that value, you're living meaningfully. To me, it's an illusion to think you can invent your own purpose, you can invent your own meaning. I think you discover them. And those are the best moments in life, and they're recorded in some of the great literature of the world, those moments when an aesthetic value appears, a moral value makes a demand on us, or an epistemic value appears, and we say, yeah, that's the truth, and I need to give myself to it. I think that's what makes life meaningful. And the crisis is that there's a great doubt about the validity and objectivity of those values. Subjectivity can be very attractive, like, oh, I make it up as I go along, but it's, in the end, not attractive. In the end, it's spiritually debilitating. And I do think that's why people like Peterson and others are so appealing, especially to young men, because they're appealing in a kind of tough spiritual director way, a tough guru way, to those objective values.
You said that the idea of inventing your own meaning, inventing your own purpose, is a vacuous one. I think I tend to agree with you, but I wonder if you'd be able to spell out for our audience why you think that's the case. It's one of the most common views that we hear in response to people throwing off religion. If you become an atheist, one of the problems you run into is, true or not, the claim is made that without some kind of religious grounding, you can't have any objective meaning. And rather than saying, yes, we can, a lot of people decide to say, well, we don't need objective meaning, we make it up for ourselves. What's the problem with that?
Well, first of all, I would say this, that an atheist can certainly be deeply in touch with objective value. epistemic, moral, and aesthetic. And that's what would give that person's life meaning. So I don't hold to the view that ipso facto an atheist has a meaningless life, because I think they can intuit meaning all over the place. Now, if you really press it philosophically, I would argue that those objective values are ordered hierarchically, and they point finally to a ground or source of their meaning. So that's, from Plato on. We have all kinds of people in the great tradition that would argue just that way. So I think the more you live in the world of objective value, it will lead you toward the source of that value, namely God. So I think that's true. But I wouldn't contest the view that an atheist can live a meaningful life. They can intuit all these different values. The trouble with self-invention, to me, is it's living in this sort of clean, well-lighted space of my own little subjectivity. And I don't allow the objective to break through into me and to broaden my life. It's like your countryman Chesterton's thing about, you need to crack some holes in the skull to let in light. The problem is a sort of self-absorption, or it's a Augustine called it being curvatus in se. I'm caved in around myself. And that's what happens, I would argue, when you walk into the Sainte-Chapelle, or you see a Cézanne painting, or you grasp the truth of a mathematical formula, or you look up into the heavens, or it's Kant, the starry sky above and the moral law within, that when you intuit these great values, it's an epiphany. It's a showing, it's a breakthrough. And that's what gives life meaning. When you say, well, I'm going to invent it for myself, to me it's very tiresome and vacuous and small. It's a small space. Augustine talked about the pusilla anima, the little soul. And the little soul, I think, is born of that self-invention prejudice. The great soul, the magna anima, is when objective value breaks in and then I can move into a higher space.
Do you think the people who say, well, I'm just going to invent my own meaning and purpose, are essentially just coping with the fact that they're beginning to recognize that their worldview doesn't have any grounding for objective meaning?
Yeah, my guess is that when they say that, they don't really mean it. They are, in fact, in touch with objective value. But they're so enamored of the value of freedom, which, by the way, is a value. I mean, personal freedom is a great moral value. But if you valorize that to the nth degree, then you get into this problem. I think people that say I'm inventing my values, in fact, very often are intuiting objective value, if you press them on it. Because we can't finally stay in that Sartrean space. Go right back to existentialism as a humanism. We said existence precedes essence. I think that's now the default position of most people today in the West. But to me, that's just it's a going nowhere position. That my freedom invents who I am. My freedom finds itself in relationship to great values that call it and condition it and summon it to something higher. That's when you're truly free.
Yeah, I mean, I've previously compared it to the idea. Well, I think it's helpful to try and understand what meaning means, right? The term is often used interchangeably with something like purpose. And I think what we're talking about is something like a non-derivative reason to act or reason to be. This is what purpose is.
Yeah.
And so the idea of having a reason to act, if you invent your own purpose, what it seems like you're doing is inventing some kind of task to fulfill or some kind of motivation to do something for its own sake.
Yeah.
It's like you don't actually have a real motivation to do something, and that's why you do it. But the lack of any motivation causes you to create a task just for the sake of having a task to fulfill, which seems a little circular, I suppose.
Right.
And we'd also be committed to the view, for instance, that if one person decides to invent their value by counting the blades of grass in their garden every day until they die, and another person decides to find their meaning and invent their purpose by raising money for Oxfam and lifting thousands of people out of poverty, that both of those people's lives are as meaningful as each other.
Yeah, and
and that just seems wrong.
Yes, and that's the Sartrean problem. And Sartre himself, I think, knew it. If you say the authentic life on his terms is the one in which, my freedom has authentically chosen its own value. Well, Sartre chose to be part of the resistance, but then how do you say the Nazi isn't authentic? The Nazi has chosen his value based upon his freedom, So how do you adjudicate those two things? And see, I would say you have to rely not on your self-inventing freedom, but on some objective value. And I would be able to say, I think, the Nazi is radically out of step with proper moral value, and the member of the Resistance was in touch with it. You can't simply appeal to the primacy of freedom and subjectivity, because then you get into precisely that dilemma. But what I find, Alex, interesting here is it's one of Aquinas' implicit arguments for God's existence. So the famous ones based on cosmology, but there's one based upon final causality. So here you are right now in your, I don't know, it's your room or your studio, and you're doing the show. So the first question, well, why? Why are you doing it? And you'd give an answer of some kind, like, well, because this is my livelihood. Well, why is that your livelihood? Well, because I want to make money. Well, why do you want to make money? Well, for this end or that end. Well, why do you think those ends are important? That with any concrete moral act, the two of us are committing a moral act right now, right? We've chosen to do something we both think is good. Well, how come? Keep asking the why question over and over and over again. You'll come finally to some uncaused cause of the will, some summum bonum. Now, I'd call that God for all sorts of reasons we can get into. But let's say it's money, success, it's fame, it's power, it's whatever. But willy-nilly, everyone's got a summum bonum. That's why the Bible would say the choice is not between theism and atheism. It's always between right worship and false worship. It's what do you consider your summum bonum? Is it the true summum bonum, or is it some false summum bonum? But everyone's got one. Right? You wouldn't, Teilhard de Chardin said that, you wouldn't get out of bed in the morning unless you were motivated by some finally unmoved mover of your will. And see, I think that's really worth thinking about. What is it that's motivating even the simplest moral act, like the two of us sitting down and having this conversation?
You said it's not between theism and atheism, but essentially choosing what it is you worship, or choosing what it is that you follow.
True worship or false worship. Right.
Because there has to be something, right? There has to be something motivating action. If there wasn't some fundamental purpose or reason that underlies every other reason you have to act, then those reasons wouldn't exist. They don't have any power of their own accord. If you're motivated to go to work so that you can make money, without the reason for making money, which might be to have a comfortable life, the reason of I want to make money doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't exist just on its own accord. It relies on something more fundamental, and this entire chain must lead back to a first cause. It's interesting. It's quite like arguments for the existence of God in terms of cosmology or something, but it's about meaning. Right.
It's final causality, not efficient causality. And that's why it's hidden in Aquinas. It's not up front, like here are my 5 ways, but it's a hidden way. But it's actually closer in spirit to Aristotle himself, who thought the final cause was the most important. And so if you pursue final causality all the way, you come to some version of summum bonum, or what, Paul Tillich, the religious philosopher, talked about ultimate concern, right? Everyone has an ultimate concern. You do, everyone does. If you didn't, you wouldn't act in any way. And Tillich always said, and I followed this in my own pastoral life, the most important question to ask about any person is, what does that person worship? Once you know that, you'll know the rest of that person's life pretty well. It'll fall into coherence. What's your ultimate concern? And he defined religion famously as ultimate concern. So in that way, then you've got either true religion, that's Augustine, vera religio, or you just got regular religio. You've got some form of false religion or false worship.
Now, what do you make of people who say that on an atheistic picture of the universe, what we essentially are as human beings are highly evolved mammals that have slowly developed this accidental consciousness to help us to survive. And so the ultimate motivating factor behind all of our behaviors, even if it's subconscious, would be something just as simple as the drive to survive, the drive to reproduce. Because, of course, somebody's not likely to say this. Some people might reference their children, but on the cognitive level, we might reference having some belief in a set of ideals, but we might say that this is essentially a way that the brain tricks itself into being more likely to survive, because by having these invented ideals, it's more likely to do the work that's going to lead us to survive. And so maybe that's the fundamental value. And I wouldn't characterize it as people worshipping their survival. it would be that this is the motivating factor, and what they're actually worshipping is some invented ideal that just helps to prolong their survival.
I know. I've never found that convincing. To me, that's just hopelessly reductionistic. I mean, to take Hamlet and say somehow I can reduce that to the survival instinct, or I can read Plato's Republic and say, well, that's finally all about the survival instinct or the Divine Comedy. To me, it's hopelessly reductionistic. Is something like bodily survival, basic instincts, ingredient probably in everything we do? Yes, I would say, because we have bodies. And the bodies have evolved from lower forms, and they have all of those instincts and impulses. I wouldn't deny that for a minute. I'm not a Platonist in that way. But I do think there's something that transcends the merely animal dimension of our life. And it's revealed in things like Hamlet and things like our ultimate concern and our quest, not just for a particular beautiful thing, but for the source of beauty. And that's that very interesting moment. It's James Joyce in A Portrait of the Artist when he's that famous scene looking out at the woman who would eventually be his wife. And he describes her in this rapturous way. And when she turns to look at him, and then he says, "Oh, heavenly God." And that's the move from Plato through Dante up to James Joyce and many others, that through the particular beautiful thing, I'm triggered into an awareness of the source of beauty, the beauty that I'm seeking implicitly in every particular beautiful thing. Or, when you grasp a mathematical relationship and it's so powerful to you, and the truth of it is not just the evanescent truth of, well, that thing is in front of me right now. It's you've grasped something that's true in any possible world, that's true at any place or time. That triggers an awareness of the source of truth. So that's how I think it works in a religious consciousness. But I go back to Plato with that intuition.
It's interesting how you characterize the position as being reductionist. I share your intuition that something like Hamlet, the idea that the production of it could be reduced to apes trying to survive, seems incredible. But the two things I would say in response to that is, firstly, this is true of all evolutionary biology, and that I might talk about some minute facet of my body, like my eyelashes or something. And the idea that the development of these particular hairs on the end of an eyelid somehow serve in the great survival of species on planet Earth, it seems so absurd and disconnected. But actually, if you draw a long enough chain of reasoning as to why we ended up here, it can be explained in those terms. And also, you said a moment ago that all the behaviors that we participate in are motivated in some way, they're moral in some way, and there's some kind of ultimate motivation. And you said that you would call this God or ground it in God, meaning that, if I choose to read a book, or if I choose to get on a plane or go to the shop to buy some food, ultimately I'm being motivated by this religious structure. And in the same way that you say, it seems absurd that Hamlet can be reduced to evolutionary biology, I might say, well, it seems absurd that me getting up and going to the shop and telling the guy to keep the change is inflatable to something like a religious structure. But I think you would say that, although that seems a little strange upon first hearing, there is a chain there that is ultimately fully explained by religion. In the same way, maybe something like Hamlet and the immense awe that human beings feel upon looking upon their loves or upon understanding the universality of mathematics is rather, depressingly, but perhaps just a very long offshoot of this struggle for survival.
Well, let's play with it for a little bit. I mean, might you trace origins of these ideas back that way? Possibly. But the experience of the idea itself in its full expression, that's where I'm balking to say, well, I'm going to sort of thereby debunk it and say, well, it's really nothing but, now fill in the blank, we're bodies. We come up from the earth, and we come up from these deeper, animal instincts and all that. I don't deny that. But I don't think you believe for a second that when you're entertaining some really high-level mathematics, even though the ultimate origin we could trace even, biologically backward, that in itself it's reducible to a mere concern for survival. That something's opened up there that transcends that dimension. And that, again, that's Plato escaping from the cave, that you've moved to a higher level of consciousness. I just balk at the reductionism because I think it mocks the truth of that experience. So bracket religion for a second. Just aesthetic experiences or epistemic experiences or really profound moral experiences. You know, when you see someone like a Maximilian Kolbe, an act of extraordinary saintly heroism in the moral order, and you say, that's explicable in evolutionary terms. I mean, I just don't buy it. I think something has opened up that mocks that kind of reductionism.
I mean, it's
Explain
a strong intuition.
Kolbe. You know what I mean? Maximilian Kolbe, who gave his life in Auschwitz. He was not chosen by the Nazis. They chose 10 people at random to die because someone escaped from the barracks. Kolbe came forward because there was a man that got to his knees and said, I have a wife and children. And so Kolbe came forward and said, I'm a Catholic priest, take me. And so the Nazis happily took him and then starved him to death. So he's one of the great martyr saints of the 20th century. I would submit to you, it's impossible to explain that on simply like evolutionary grounds or
Still
some,
here, God
some
bless you. You're
variation of the
recommending
survival
BO6.
instinct. I mean, I think it mocks the
It's not going to last.
the
as being
moral
entertaining or fun
splendor
for me,
of that act.
but I
And I
like
think there's
the,
something that's concomitant in the
tradition.
epistemic and the aesthetic order too.
I mean, do you think it's truly impossible? I mean, I understand that it's depressing and potentially insulting, as you suggest there with the term mocking, to reduce such an act of heroism to biological drives. But I think that people interested in this line of thought are essentially trying to explain a phenomena.
Is this a
They're
game
saying we
that
have this
you're gonna be
phenomena
looking at
of
playing?
these animals that decide to sacrifice themselves for each other, and somebody comes along and says, well, look, I mean, in the evolution of mankind, people share their genes. You know, if somebody is an adult, they might sacrifice themselves easily for their children on an evolutionary ground. It's so easy to see evolutionarily why it would be that a father would sacrifice himself for his children, especially if the father isn't going to have any more kids. On a purely survival of the genes approach, it's the most straightforward thing in the world to see why that would be the case. Similarly, you can see why it might happen for a brother or a cousin, and you can expand this to strangers who share some genetics in the
see how
human
you're
race.
stretching that so thin now. I mean, you're beginning with something, as you say, is somewhat credible, intelligible. But now you're stretching it. To read someone like Kolbe, to understand his act of self-sacrifice that way, I just don't buy it. I mean, I get it. I've read the arguments but I just don't think it honors the integrity of what's happening there. You know,
But this is why I wanted to bring this up in this way, is to say that that first step of saying, well, the father sacrifices himself for his son or his children, let's say, and somebody comes along and says, I think this can be explained in terms of the survival of genes. I don't think it would be appropriate to say, well, you're mocking the sacrifice, or you're diminishing the sacrifice, or you're ruining the moral import of that sacrifice. I think all they're doing is explaining it. And so, you know, be it we may be sort of stretching things a bit more thinly, but the terminology that you used of trying to explain such a sacrifice by reference to the survival of genes being first impossible. I think it's just impossible to describe it in these terms.
Right,
and second, that it mocks the moral sacrifice. If it doesn't do it in the first case, with the father sacrificing him.
Thank you for everyone who popped in. Crazy Heifer, if you're around later, feel free to add me on here. There's my Activision thing that you can add, and we can definitely run some matches later if that's something you're down for. Otherwise, God bless you, everyone. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll catch you on the flip side.